Dawa Nuna, Dawa Ngunnawal. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land at which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, emerging leaders, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders gathered here with us today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Government House, Canberra. I welcome viewers from around Australia, particularly from Teddy's hometown of Latrobe in Tasmania, and those overseas who are watching this ceremony live. My name is Paul Singer, and I'm the Official Secretary to the Governor-General. On behalf of the Governor-General of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley and Her Excellency Mrs Linda Hurley, it is a great pleasure to welcome you on this very special occasion. Participating in today's ceremony, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Scott Morrison, the Leader of the Federal Opposition, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, the Minister for Defence, Senator the Honourable Linda Reynolds, and the Chief of Defence Force, General Angus Campbell. I also acknowledge the presence of representing the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr Gavin Pearce, and representing the President of the Senate, Senator the Honourable Erica Betts, representing the Chief Justice of Australia, Justice Virginia Bell, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Her Excellency Ms Nanetta Barbalescu and Mr Dan Barbalescu, the British High Commissioner, Her Excellency Mrs Vicky Trudell, the Ambassador of the Netherlands, Her Excellency Mrs Marion Derris and Mr Chef Eisermans, the Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Darren Chester, the Shadow Minister for Defence, the Honourable Richard Miles, the Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Shane Newman, the Tasmanian Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Guy Barnett, Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnson, Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Rick Burr, Chief of Air Force, Air Marshal Mel Hupfeld, and senior members of the Australian Defence Force. The Secretaries of the Department of Defence, Mr Greg Moriarty, the Department of Veterans Affairs, Ms Liz Cosson, representing the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Ms Stephanie Foster, Chairman of the Australian War Memorial Council, Mr Kerry Stokes, Director of the Australian War Memorial, Mr Matt Anderson, the President of the National Returned and Services League of Australia, Major General Greg Malik, representing the Australian Bravery Association, Mr Andrew Kendall. I'm delighted to welcome recipients of the Cross of Valour, Mr Alan Sparks, CV, Mr Darryl Tree, CV, and Mr Victor Bosco, CV. And a very warm welcome to members of the Sheean family with us here today. Welcome all. Ladies and gentlemen, the Victoria Cross for Australia is the preeminent award for acts of bravery in wartime and Australia's highest military honour. It is awarded to persons who display the most conspicuous gallantry, a daring or preeminent act of valour or self-sacrifice, or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. The Victoria Cross was created by Queen Victoria in 1856. The medals are all handmade from the same cannon by Hancock's and Company Jewellers of London. The Victoria Cross for Australia was instituted in the Australian Honours System by Letters Patent on the 15th of January 1991 and replaced British or Imperial Victoria Cross. To date, 100 Australians have been awarded the Victoria Cross. 6 in the Boer War between 1899 and 1902, 64 in World War I between 1914 and 1918, including 9 for service at Gallipoli, 2 in North Russia in 1919, 20 in World War II between 1939 and 1945, 4 in Vietnam between 1962 and 1972, and 4 in Afghanistan. Amongst us here today, I particularly welcome Victoria Cross recipient Daniel Kieran, VC, and representing the late Cameron Baird, VC, his father, Doug Baird. Today, with the presentation of the 101st Victoria Cross to an Australian and the first for a member of the Royal Australian Navy, we pause to honour the service and ultimate sacrifice of Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean, VC. Shortly, I'll invite you to stand for the arrival of the Governor-General and Mrs Hurley. Please remain standing, and after the Guard has departed, join with Your Excellencies in singing the Australian National Anthem. I will then read the citation and invite Teddy Sheean's nephew, Mr Gary Ivory, to receive the insignia from the Governor-General on behalf of the Sheean family. After the presentation, I'll invite the Governor-General to deliver his address, followed by speeches from the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, Minister for Defence and Chief of Defence Force. Mr Ivory and members of the Sheean family will then join Their Excellencies, the Minister for Defence, the Chief of Defence Force and the Chief of Navy for formal photographs, while other guests are invited to proceed to the Lakeside Terrace for refreshments and lunch in honour of Teddy Sheean. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand for the arrival of Her Excellencies, the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia and Mrs Hurley, and then remain standing for the singing of the Australian National Anthem after the Guard has departed.
Guard, attention! Guard, shoulder, arms. Australia's Federation Guard, Royal Salute, stand! Arms. Guard, shoulder, arms. Guard, outwards, turn. Guard, by the left, wing.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is built by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Beneath our radiant southern cross, we'll toil with hearts in hands to make this commonwealth of ours renowned of all the lands. For those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plans to share. With courage let us all combine to advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Thank you. Please be seated. Your Excellency, to be awarded the Victoria Cross for Australia, Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean, for the most conspicuous gallantry and a pre-eminent act of valour in the presence of the enemy during a Japanese aerial attack on HMAS Armidale in the Timor Sea on the 1st of December 1942. On this day, 78 years ago, during operations in the Timor Sea, HMAS Armidale came under aerial bombardment and torpedo attack from Japanese aircraft. Shortly after the commencement of the attack, Armidale was hit by a torpedo and began listing to port. 1 minute later, the ship was hit by a second torpedo, which broke the vessel's back, causing the captain to order abandon ship. Ordinary Seaman Sheean, one of the youngest and most junior-ranked members of Armidale Ship's Company, made his way to the stowage position of the motorboat and assisted in its launch. As the enemy continued to fire upon the ship and his shipmates who were already in the water, Ordinary Seaman Sheean decided to forego his opportunity for survival by not abandoning ship and instead returning to his action station to man the aft Oerlikon gun, where he was the loader, not the gunner. Despite being wounded, he strapped himself into the gun and commenced firing at the enemy, damaging at least 2 enemy aircraft. Ordinary Seaman Sheean's actions disrupted and distracted the enemy from strafing and killing his defenceless shipmates in the water. He sacrificed his life trying to save his shipmates, and despite his wounds, he continued firing the gun until the ship sank and took him to his death. His preeminent act of valour and most conspicuous gallantry saved Australian lives. His heroism became the standard to which the men and women of the Australian Defence Force aspire. Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean awarded the Victoria Cross for Australia. Accepting the award on behalf of the Sheean family is Teddy Sheean's nephew, Mr. Gary Ivory. I now invite the Governor-General to make his address.
Well, good morning all and welcome to what is an exceptional and special occasion in both the life of Government House here, life of the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Defence Force and, of course, for the family and friends of Teddy Sheean. A great privilege to be able to participate in this ceremony today. I'll begin by acknowledging that Government House at Yarralumla sits on the land of the traditional owners of the Ngunnawal people. I do thank them for their care for this beautiful part of our country for generation after generation and pay respects to elders past and present. Could I acknowledge all our distinguished guests that we have with us today for this occasion and thank you for honouring Teddy Sheean with your presence. Today, of course, is a momentous and a historic day for the Sheean family, many of whom are here with us at Yarralumla, and for other members watching online, for the community of Tasmania, for the Royal Australian Navy and indeed the entire ADF, and for Australia. It's a day to remember Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean, to acknowledge the gallantry, courage and selflessness he showed 78 years ago today, and to reflect on his legacy and what it means to us today. Since Her Majesty the Queen approved the awarding of the Victoria Cross for Australia to Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean in August, we have witnessed an outpouring of emotion. Linda and I saw this emotion on the faces of Teddy's family last week in Tasmania. We've seen it on the faces of veterans and of our modern sailors, and on the faces of serving members of the Army and the Air Force, all who have celebrated this announcement. I have on my staff here at Government House 5 sailors, 3 currently serving, 2 retired, who by coincidence, 2 of them are from Tasmania. They would not be embarrassed by me sharing that they were filled with pride and emotion when the announcement was made. Beyond the naval and military communities, we have seen Australians of all ages respond to Teddy's story. It's worth pausing to think about why this is so. Why, 78 years on, does one young man's bravery continue to resonate? Firstly, think about Australia in 1942. We had been at war for 3 years. Part of our army was fighting tooth and nail in the Middle East. Others had been captured by the Japanese near to home. Our Navy had lost ships in both the Mediterranean and the Pacific. And a large number of our trained airmen were committed in desperate battle over Europe. Each of those serving had left behind loved ones who both longed for and, fearing the most, dreaded receiving news from the front. Compounding this stress, the enemy was on our doorstep. Darwin was bombed, Broome was strafed, and midget subs entered Sydney Harbour. Australia was under threat, our future uncertain, but we stood our ground. This is a backdrop against which Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean enlisted. It's part of why Teddy's story is relevant to us today, particularly given the events of the last year, because in the toughest of times, he and many like him stepped up to serve their country. The story also resonates because of Teddy himself. Linda and I had the pleasure of meeting some of his relatives who knew him. By all accounts, he was charismatic, popular, loud, and bursting with confidence. His rowdy last night in Latrobe before departing is still a strong part of local folklore. In the words of Dr. Ray Leonard, the last surviving sailor from the Armidale, he was the youngest man in the ship, but also one of the most outspoken. He came across as popular, affable, warm, likeable man. He didn't speak quietly. He was not lacking in confidence. He was a go-getter. He was also fiercely loyal. In the words of his nephew Jim Shea, who was 11 when Teddy went off to the war and who is here with us today, he never picked a fight, but he never walked away from one. Teddy was clearly memorable to those who knew him. But in a sense, he wasn't unique. We all know someone like this. They are our sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, our friends. This familiarity is another reason Teddy's story continues to resonate. And thirdly, there is the action itself, where the ordinary turns to the extraordinary. A rapidly sinking ship, enemy planes strafing Teddy's shipmates, the chance of survival, real, but spurned in an instant by his decision to return to his gun to try to save his mates, sacrificing himself for others. It is inspirational, and it should inspire us. At that moment, Teddy Sheean exemplified the characteristics that our first Anzacs left us: mateship, endurance, courage, and sacrifice. Finally, Teddy's story resonates because of those who have carried it forward. The family, the shipmates, and the community who never let him be forgotten, who insisted and persisted to bring us to today. So to Gary Ivory and all involved, on behalf of all Australians, thank you. Today, we remember and honour Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean. His story resonates because of Australians we continue to see and hope to see part of Teddy in the world around us: selflessness, loyalty and honour. On behalf of all Australians, I acknowledge his remarkable service, gallantry and sacrifice. May we all remember it, honour it and learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now a message from the Prime Minister, the Honourable Scott Morrison.
On this day, 78 years ago, a young man from Tasmania was bound for Timor. A farm labourer who had become a gunloader, an ordinary seaman who would do an extraordinary thing. None of us will ever know what made him do it, said one of the survivors of the HMAS Armidale. Today, as our country awards its most sacred military honour, we ask ourselves the question asked all those years ago. Why did Edward Teddy Sheean make the choice that he did that day? To help free a motorboat, but decide not to board it. To forsake a possible rescue, climb a listing deck and strap himself in. To fire at enemy aircraft until he slipped beneath the waves. To say Teddy Sheean gave his life for his country really doesn't quite capture the fearless grip he had on it until the very end. Everything he did was deliberate. It was determined to save his shipmates from being strafed in the sea. Why would anyone expect the youngest and most junior sailor on the ship to take the actions that he did? Maybe Teddy yearned to live up to the example of his 5 older brothers who joined the services before him. Maybe in the cramped confines of the Armidale, he felt the same bonds of affection that he felt sharing a home with many of his 14 siblings. Or maybe the lessons of the Sisters of Mercy stayed with him. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Truth be known, the motivations and braveries and intricacies of the human heart are a mystery to us all, and even more so when someone's actions reflect a strength not imagined. Whatever it was that caused Teddy Sheean to act so decisively and determinedly on that afternoon of blue skies and calm seas, we find ourselves being inextricably drawn to it, prompting us to ask ourselves, how can we lead lives as meaningful, as selfless, as courageous as the young life of Teddy Sheean and the generation he more broadly embodies? We see in him and we see in them the highest values of sacrifice and stoicism, courage and abiding inner strength. But there was a great cost. Teddy Sheean never saw the end of the war or the peace he helped secure, when former enemies became lasting friends. He didn't marry his sweetheart Kathleen or enjoy the long life that many of his shipmates did. That was the price of his valour that day. Though Teddy Sheean's bravery and name has always been known, we all know this honour did not come easy. And it is to the credit of his family and supporters that they lived out the motto of HMAS Sheean, fight on. 6 decades after Teddy's death, that submarine named in his honour made its first trip to Devonport, not far from where Teddy grew up. It is said that his sister Ivy watched it quietly enter the Mersey, and she said she felt as if Teddy had finally come home. Today, almost 8 decades on from Teddy's brave actions, we know his story grows with the ages. He now takes his place as one of the guiding lights of the country he indeed served to save. Teddy would have turned 97 this month. His life brings to mind the words of the British officer and poet Thomas Mordaunt. One crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. The name, the example, the glorious life of Edward Teddy Sheean VC will always be remembered, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now welcome the Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Anthony Albanese.
Distinguished guests, but particularly Teddy's family and friends who've made the trip here. When World War II was raging, it might have been easy for Teddy Sheean to stay home. Growing up in Tasmania, he could have felt the false security of distance. Instead, he signed up. In the Second World War, there wasn't the naive sense of adventure that carried so many off to the First. The war had come to Australia, and like 5 of his own brothers, Teddy went. He went for all of us. In a time when the light in the world was being driven back by the forces of darkness, Teddy knew this was not a fight that he could turn his back on. Teddy had not even experienced his first full year of adulthood when he met his fate in the air attack on HMAS Armidale. Already wounded and with the sky above him chaotic with death, he made his decision. At the moment his mates were at their most vulnerable, Teddy strapped himself to that gun on a sinking ship. That wonderful painting that's at the War Memorial, that was our first introduction for so many of us to Teddy Sheean. He was not even a gunner, but in that moment, Teddy became a shield extended over his mates in the water. An ordinary seaman who rose to the extraordinary circumstances that he found himself in. Think of those who lived because of him, those who could go on and create new generations because of him. How many lives can be traced back to that moment of self-sacrifice? The awarding of the Victoria Cross to Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean is a great credit to the persistence of his family and indeed to their fellow Tasmanians who campaigned for so long with such vigour in order to achieve today. This is a day of solemn pride for us all, a particularly important day for the Royal Australian Navy, but for the entire Australian Defence Force. Indeed, it is a proud day for all Australians.
Thank you, Mr Albanese. I now invite the Minister for Defence, Senator the Honourable Linda Reynolds.
Your Excellencies, Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, Chief of the Defence Force, Chief of Navy, members of the Sheean family and his friends, and ladies and gentlemen all. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of this land and of the home of our much-loved Yarralumla, and pay my respect to elders, past and present. And as Minister for Defence, I also pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have served and continue to serve our nation with such great distinction. 78 years ago today, our nation lost a young hero, and we have stood proud on his broad shoulders ever since. That was Teddy Sheean's day, and it was his last day. A day that has for decades dwelt very heavily on the minds of Teddy's family and his community, indeed many Australians. Determined to find the truth of what happened that fateful day aboard HMAS Armidale. Determined to ensure that Teddy received the recognition that he deserved. That recognition has now come. And today, Teddy's day has again come. I often say that while our servicemen and women list voluntarily, their families are conscripts to service. Teddy, as we've heard from the Governor-General, he enlisted with great gusto and gave his life willingly and selflessly. And Teddy's family did what all service families do: support their loved ones while they serve and endure a lifetime of grief and pain when they don't return. In Teddy's death, his family made a choice too. They chose to ensure that Teddy's name, his actions and his memory were honoured in a way that is befitting of his service. Today, nearly 8 decades on, Teddy is recognised with our nation's highest award for valour, the Victoria Cross for Australia. And on behalf of the Defence and veteran communities, I congratulate and I thank the Sheean family. I express our admiration for them, for all of those who have shared and followed Teddy's story, contributing to finding the truth, to our nation finding the truth of the 1st of December 1942. And I acknowledge Teddy's shipmates who were there on that tragic day when Teddy went down with HMAS Armidale, fighting to his very last breath for his mates and for his country. Above all, Teddy, this is your day. Let the joy of this occasion sing for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I now welcome the Chief of Defence Force, General Angus Campbell.
The Sheean family, Your Excellencies, today we celebrate the short, extraordinary life of Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean, VC. He is a shining example to the men and women of the Australian Defence Force, a beacon by which to navigate. He was 18 years old. He was new to the Navy. He wasn't a high-ranking officer. He wasn't versed in the responsibilities of commanders to their crews. He wasn't a philosopher, a poet, a politician. His future wasn't yet told. He was an ordinary seaman who displayed extraordinary courage. He disobeyed an order issued for his own safety. He saw the lives of his mates vulnerable and under attack in the Timor Sea, and he felt compelled to act. As a parent, it's hard not to think of the dreams that Teddy's family would have had for his future. Teddy relinquished that future so that those he cared for might cling tightly to their own. As the Armidale slipped below the waves, he remained strapped to the gun, serving his country and his mates to the last beat of his heart. He was 18 years old. As we honour Teddy's heroic actions, we also reaffirm the values that he fought to uphold, our values that speak to our modern Defence Force and are as relevant now as they were then, values of service, of courage, respect, integrity and excellence. He joins a pantheon of sailors, soldiers, airmen and women whose stories, told and untold, confirm that same basic truth, the truth that guides us through dark waters, across the driest of deserts and the most turbulent of storms, that greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends.
Thank you, General Campbell. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please be seated and join me in acknowledging the participation in today's ceremony by the crew of HMAS Armidale, who are currently in location of the sinking of Teddy Sheean's HMAS Armidale. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's formal investiture ceremony. I now invite Gary Ivory and members of the Sheean family to join with Their Excellencies, the Minister for Defence, the Chief of Defence Force and the Chief of Navy for formal photographs. And guests are invited to make their way through the House onto the Lakeside Terrace where refreshments are served before lunch in honour of Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheean, VC. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand for the departure of Her Excellencies, the Governor-General and Mrs Hurley.